What if Arizona's deserts hide horrors beyond comprehension? Welcome to Unheard Fears. Tonight, 9 true incidents that defy explanation. From techno-terror on Route 93 to cosmic nightmares beneath Scottsdale. Names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. But these events are real, documented, and utterly terrifying. As you watch, ask yourself, could this happen where you live? Drop your location and current time in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true horror from the shadows. My name is Odin, and I've spent the last 6 years climbing communication towers across the Southwest. But nothing prepared me for what happened at the Route 93 relay station outside Kingman, Arizona in March 2019. I was scheduled for routine maintenance on a cellular tower that sits about 40 miles north of the city. One of those isolated sites where you don't see another soul for hours, and the desert stretches out like an ocean of sand and scrub brush. The company dispatcher told me it would be a simple 4-hour job. Check the transmitter arrays, replace a few corroded connectors, verify signal strength, and head home before sunset. I arrived just after 2 in the afternoon when the sun was bleaching everything white, and the heat shimmered off the asphalt in waves that looked almost liquid. The tower stood 200 feet tall, a lattice of steel painted that industrial orange-red that's supposed to warn aircraft. And at its base sat a small equipment shed containing backup generators and monitoring systems. I parked my truck, grabbed my tool belt and testing equipment, and started the climb up the maintenance ladder, welded to the tower's south face. About halfway up, maybe 100 feet off the ground, I noticed my radio meter was showing readings that didn't make sense. Electromagnetic interference spiking in frequencies that shouldn't have had any traffic on them at all. I made a mental note to check the transmitter logs when I reached the platform, thinking maybe some amateur radio operator was bleeding into our bandwidth. But when I got to the top and connected my diagnostic laptop to the primary array, the readings got stranger. The spectrum analyzer was lighting up with signals across bands that were supposedly empty, and when I plugged in my headset to listen, I heard something that made my skin go cold. It was a voice, clear as day, speaking directly to me through the static. Odin, it said, and my real name came through those headphones like someone was standing right next to me in that empty sky. You're 43 minutes late for the scheduled maintenance window. I yanked the headphones off and looked around, my heart hammering against my ribs. But there was nothing up there except me, the equipment, and the endless desert spreading out in every direction below. The voice wasn't on any registered frequency. I checked every channel, every bandwidth, commercial and military and everything in between, but it kept coming through, persistent and calm, like whoever was speaking had all the time in the world. I tried switching frequencies on my handheld radio, tried calling dispatch on the company channel, but all I got was that voice again, this time saying things it shouldn't have known. Your supervisor assigned you this tower because the previous technician, Brantley, stopped responding to calls on August 7th, 2003, the voice said, and I felt my stomach drop because I'd never heard that name before, never been told anything about a previous technician going missing. The incident was classified as voluntary abandonment of duty. His truck was found at the base. He was never seen again. I pulled up the tower's maintenance history on my laptop, with shaking hands, scrolling through years of service records. And there it was, a gap in the logs from August 2003, a period of 3 weeks where no maintenance was recorded at all, and then a note in the system that simply read, "Reassigned primary technician effective September 1st. My mouth went dry, and I tasted copper on my tongue, that metallic tang you get when fear really sets in deep. The equipment around me started behaving impossibly. Digital displays flickering through numbers in reverse sequence, signal meters pegging at maximum output when nothing was transmitting, and my laptop screen showing data that contradicted itself line by line. The connection requires completion, the voice said again, and this time it had changed, deepening into something that sounded less human and more like multiple voices layered over each other with a mechanical screech underneath. "You've climbed into the broadcast zone. The signal has been waiting." I looked at the transformer box mounted to the platform railing, the high-voltage warning sticker bright yellow against gray metal, and I realized the voice was instructing me. No, compelling me to touch the live terminals. Static electricity was making every hair on my arm stand up straight, and I could feel a numbness starting to spread through my fingertips where I'd been gripping the metal railing. The air smelled like ozone and burning plastic, that particular stench you get when electrical components start to fail, and I could see heat distortion rising off the transformer, even though the temperature gauge read normal. I backed away from the equipment, my boots scraping against the platform's diamond plate flooring, and started down the ladder as fast as I could without losing my grip. The voice followed me through my headset, which I'd forgotten I was still wearing, speaking faster now, the words overlapping and distorting. Previous technician refused completion. Previous technician entered the frequency at 0200 hours August 7th. Previous technician is still transmitting. I was maybe 30 feet from the ground when I looked up and saw something that made me freeze on the ladder. The tower's warning lights, which should have been steady red beacons, were pulsing in a pattern that looked deliberate, almost like Morse code. And in the spaces between the pulses, I could swear I saw a silhouette standing on the platform I'd just left. A human shape that shouldn't have been possible because I was the only person up there. My hands were slipping on the ladder rungs, partly from sweat and partly from whatever that numbness was that had been spreading through my fingers. And I could taste something bitter in the back of my throat, like I'd been chewing on copper wire. When my boots finally hit the ground, I ran to my truck without looking back, threw my equipment in the bed, and started the engine with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. My radio crackled to life on its own, and the voice came through one last time, perfectly clear, despite the fact that I wasn't near the tower anymore and my handheld was turned off. Signal spike recorded. Technician departed before completion. Cycle continues. Next scheduled occurrence 16 years from initial contact. I drove back to Kingman with my windows down and my radio unplugged. The desert wind loud enough to drown out the ringing in my ears. Back at the office, I filed a report about faulty equipment and recommended the tower be inspected by a full crew. But when I checked the system the next morning, my report had been marked as completed and the tower listed as fully operational. I pulled up the personnel records, something I probably wasn't supposed to have access to, and found the name the voice had mentioned. Brantley, a tower technician who'd worked for the company from 1998 to 2003, whose last recorded assignment was that exact tower on Route 93, whose employment file ended with a single word in the termination reason field: unavailable. I made some calls to old-timers in the company, guys who'd been working the towers for decades, and one of them finally told me the story everyone seemed to know but nobody talked about: how Brantley had been found wandering Highway 93 3 weeks after his truck was discovered at the tower base, completely incoherent, unable to explain where he'd been or what had happened, speaking in what sounded like radio frequencies instead of words. They'd committed him to a facility in Phoenix, and he died there in 2011, still transmitting those sounds, still trying to complete whatever connection the tower had demanded. I calculated the dates, counted back 16 years from August 2003, and found another incident, a technician in 1987 who disappeared from the same site, found later with no memory of the missing time. 16 years before that, in 1971, a FCC inspector had vanished during a routine check of the newly installed tower, his body never recovered. The pattern went back to the tower's construction in 1955, a cycle of disappearances and strange occurrences happening every 16 years, like clockwork, and my incident in March 2019 fit perfectly into that timeline. I requested a transfer to a different region, told them I wanted to work coastal installations in California instead of desert sites, and they approved it without asking questions, almost like they'd been expecting it. I still work on towers, Still climb into the sky with my tools and my testing equipment. But I never go near Route 93 anymore. Never take assignments in that particular stretch of Arizona desert. Sometimes late at night when I'm working on a tower somewhere else, I'll hear strange interference in my headset, voices that aren't quite voices speaking in frequencies that shouldn't exist. And I wonder if the connection ever really lets go, or if it's just waiting, patient and eternal, for the next scheduled occurrence. The mathematics are simple and terrible. 16 years from March 2019 means someone else will climb that tower in 2035. We'll hear their name spoken through equipment that shouldn't know it. We'll be invited to complete what Brantley started and what I refused. I keep a journal now, documenting every strange reading, every impossible signal, every moment when the equipment behaves in ways that defy physics and logic. Maybe it's evidence, maybe it's paranoia, but I need to remember what happened up there on that platform. Need to keep the memory sharp and clear so I never convince myself it was just heat exhaustion or equipment malfunction or some rational explanation that would let me sleep easier at night. The truth is simpler and stranger than any explanation I could invent. There's something transmitting from that tower, something that's been broadcasting since before cellular networks existed, something that reaches out every 16 years looking for someone to complete the frequency. I refused, just like Brantley refused, just like the others before him, probably refused until the pattern broke them down into static and silence. What's waiting at the other end of that connection? What would have happened if I'd touched those live terminals and let the current flow through me into whatever network exists beyond our understanding? Those are questions I'm grateful I never answered. But they follow me still, persistent as the voice in my headphones, patient as the desert itself, waiting for the next technician who'll climb that tower and hear their name spoken in frequencies that shouldn't exist, wondering if this time someone will finally say yes and complete the transmission that's been trying to finish itself for 70 years. My name is Avery, and back in October 1997, I was 24 years old and pursuing my graduate degree in American Frontier Studies at Arizona State University. My thesis focused on Mormon settlement patterns in isolated territories, specifically examining how religious communities maintained cohesion during the territorial period before statehood. I'd received a research grant to document abandoned homesteads across northern Arizona, photographing structures and cataloging artifacts that could provide insight into daily life during the 1870s and 1880s. That's what brought me to Snowflake on a cool autumn evening, driving my beat-up Honda through miles of empty rangeland as the sun dropped toward the horizon and painted everything in shades of amber and rust. The homestead I'd come to study sat about 8 miles outside town limits, accessible only by a dirt road that had mostly reverted to 2 tire tracks through the scrub grass and juniper trees. According to county records, the property had been established in 1878 by one of the original founding families, a substantial farm complex that included a main house, several outbuildings, and what the surveyor's map labeled as a root cellar. The structures were all but forgotten now, marked on modern maps as ruins, and the university archivist had warned me that most of the buildings would be dangerous to enter due to decades of neglect and weather damage. I arrived around 6:30, parked near what remained of a fence line, and spent the fading daylight hours photographing the exteriors and taking notes on construction methods, the thick adobe walls, the hand-hewn timber supports, the ingenious water catchment system that had once fed cisterns buried beneath the courtyard. When darkness came on fast, the way it does in the high desert, I set up my tent between my car and the main house, made a simple dinner on my camp stove, and settled in with my recording equipment to transcribe the day's observations. Around 10 o'clock, I heard something that didn't fit the normal night sounds of wind and distant coyotes, a rhythmic creaking like old hinges moving, coming from somewhere beneath the main house. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the structure carefully, testing each floorboard before putting my weight on it, following the sound to what I'd assumed was just a shallow depression in the dirt floor of what had been the kitchen. But when I swept away the accumulated sand and debris, I found a wooden hatch secured with an iron ring, the wood still solid despite its age, preserved by the dry climate. The creaking sound came from below, regular and purposeful, and against my better judgment, I lifted the hatch and shone my light down into darkness that seemed to swallow the beam. Stone steps led down into a cellar much larger and more elaborate than the external measurements of the house suggested possible. The walls were mortared stone extending at least 15 feet down, and at the bottom, I could see shelving units and what looked like storage containers. The air rising from below smelled wrong, not the expected must and earth, but something chemical and organic mixed together, like formaldehyde and sage smoke. I descended the steps with my flashlight gripped tight and my camera bag slung over my shoulder, documenting what I assumed would be a remarkable example of frontier food preservation techniques. The cellar opened into a chamber maybe 20 feet square, the walls lined with rough-hewn shelves, and on those shelves sat hundreds of glass jars, the kind you'd use for canning vegetables or preserving fruit. But when I examined them more closely, moving between the rows with my flashlight catching on curved glass surfaces, I realized the contents weren't vegetables. Each jar contained something biological, floating in clear liquid, tissue samples, organ matter, things that looked disturbingly human in their structure and size. Labels on the jars were written in faded ink using archaic spelling, dates ranging from 1838 through what I could barely make out as 1994, and names I didn't recognize, followed by phrases like departed covenant and released from service. My hands started shaking as I photographed the jars, my academic training telling me to document everything even as my instincts screamed to run. I counted 47 jars on one shelf alone, each containing carefully preserved specimens that had no place in a frontier homestead's root cellar, each labeled with methodical precision that suggested ritual rather than practicality. That's when I heard footsteps above me. Not the random settling of old timbers, but deliberate footfalls crossing the floor I'd just been walking on, accompanied by voices speaking in low murmurs that seemed to circle the hatch opening. I clicked off my flashlight and pressed myself against the stone wall, my breath catching in my chest as candlelight began to illuminate the stairway and figures descended into the cellar in a slow procession. There were 7 of them. Elderly people dressed in clothing that looked like it belonged to a previous century. Simple, homespun fabrics, severe cuts. The kind of thing you'd see in historical photographs of frontier congregations. They carried candles in glass holders and moved with the practiced coordination of people performing a familiar ceremony, arranging themselves in a semicircle around the shelves, while completely ignoring my presence, as if I wasn't there at all, or as if my being there was somehow expected. The one who appeared oldest, a woman whose face was weathered like canyon rock, began speaking in a dialect I recognized as archaic Mormon terminology mixed with phrases I couldn't place, rhythmic and repetitive like liturgy. The others responded in unison, their voices creating harmonics that made the candlelight flicker and dance across the jars, and I watched as they removed 3 specific containers from the shelves with reverent care. They set the jars on a small table I hadn't noticed before, arranged candles around them in a pattern that formed interlocking triangles, and continued their chanting while the woman opened each jar with a key that looked like tarnished silver. The smell that filled the cellar was overwhelming, formaldehyde sharp enough to make my eyes water, mixed with something sweet and rotten that coated the back of my throat. I tried to stay silent but couldn't help a small gasp, and that's when they all turned to look at me simultaneously, their faces showing no surprise, only a kind of sad acknowledgement. The old woman spoke directly to me then, her voice gentle but carrying absolute authority. "You've witnessed the renewal ceremony," she said, not accusatory, but stating fact. This covenant has been maintained since the founding of our community in 1878. We preserve those who chose to leave, who rejected the old ways for the corruptions of the outer world. She gestured to the jars with one gnarled hand. Every 16 years, we renew the preservation, we speak the names, we remember the choices that required. Severance. I found my voice enough to ask what I already suspected but desperately hoped wasn't true. These are people. These jars contain parts of people who left Snowflake. The woman nodded slowly. Those who abandon covenant abandon community. What leaves must be preserved, must be kept as reminder and warning. You're not of our bloodline, child. You should not have seen this. Another member of the group, a man whose face seemed too smooth for his apparent age, stepped forward. The last outsider who witnessed renewal was in 1979. He chose to join rather than carry the knowledge away. You face the same choice. My camera bag suddenly felt heavy against my hip, the evidence I'd collected worth nothing if I couldn't leave with it. I backed toward the stairs, slowly, maintaining eye contact with the woman, speaking as calmly as I could manage. I'm just a student documenting old homesteads. I'll leave tonight. I won't tell anyone what I saw. The group moved then, not quickly but with purpose, beginning to block my access to the stairway, and I realized they'd performed this exact scenario before, had protocol for dealing with unwanted witnesses. The woman's voice took on a hypnotic quality as she spoke about the beauty of preservation, the sanctity of keeping what was lost, the honor of joining their eternal collection. I could feel my thoughts getting fuzzy, my resolve weakening, and I understood that whatever they were doing involved more than just words. There was something in the smoke from those candles, something in the rhythmic chanting that made acquiescence feel inevitable and right. I broke for the stairs in a blind panic, shouldering past the nearest figure and taking the stone steps 3 at a time, my boots skidding on surfaces, made slick by centuries of use. Hands grabbed at my jacket, but I twisted free, bursting up through the hatch into the main house with my lungs burning and my heart threatening to explode. Behind me, I could hear them ascending, still chanting, still speaking in that dialect that seemed to carry physical weight. I ran through the ruined house, through the doorway, across the open ground to my car, fumbling with keys that felt slippery in my sweat-soaked hands. The engine turned over on the second try, and I accelerated down that dirt road without looking back, my headlights bouncing wildly as the car bucked over ruts and rocks, wheat fields on either side rustling in wind that blew the wrong direction, pushing against my escape rather than with it. I drove straight through to Flagstaff, didn't stop until I was surrounded by streetlights and late-night traffic and the solid reality of modern civilization. The next morning, I returned to that location with a sheriff's deputy I'd convinced to escort me, ready to file official reports and hand over my photographic evidence. But when we reached the coordinates where the homestead should have been, there was nothing, just empty desert, not even foundation stones or fence posts, just scrub grass and sand and juniper trees that looked like they'd been growing undisturbed for decades. The deputy checked his GPS 3 times, confirmed we were at the exact location I'd described, and suggested gently that maybe I'd gotten turned around in the dark, maybe visited a different site than I'd intended. I still have the photographs from inside that cellar, dozens of images showing the jars and their labels and the figures in the candlelight. But every single frame came out blank when I had the film developed. Just white rectangles with faint shadows that could be anything or nothing. The county records I'd consulted show the homestead existed, show its construction and its original inhabitants, but make no mention of its current status or location and list the property as absorbed into federal land, designation removed 1955. Sometimes I dream about that cellar, about the preservation jars lined up in their endless rows, about my name written in that archaic script on a label waiting to be filled, and I wonder if the covenant they spoke of was ever truly about religion, or if it was something older and stranger that the Mormon settlers found already waiting in that stretch of Arizona desert, something they incorporated into their faith because ignoring it wasn't an option. I finished my graduate degree using different research sites, avoided Snowflake entirely, and never went back to study isolated frontier communities again. But I still think about what the old woman said, about choices requiring severance, about preservation as both reminder and warning, and I understand that some historical documentation isn't meant to be preserved because the history itself is still active, still performing its ceremonies, still maintaining covenants that predate our understanding of what community truly costs. If you discovered something impossible hidden beneath an abandoned building, would you investigate further or trust your instincts to leave immediately? My name is Rodrigo, and for 8 years I led tourist groups through the mapped sections of Colossal Cave Mountain Park near Vail, Arizona, reciting the same geological facts and historical anecdotes twice daily to visitors who came to escape the July heat in the constant 70-degree temperature of the limestone chambers. I knew every formation by name, every twist in the passageway, every spot where the ceiling dropped low enough that tall visitors had to duck their heads. The cave system extends for miles beneath the Santa Rita Mountains, though only about half a mile of passages are open to public tours, the rest sealed off by metal gates and warning signs that cite safety concerns and ongoing research. On the 14th of July, 2014, I was wrapping up the final tour of the day with a group of 12 people, families mostly, a couple of college kids, a retired gentleman who kept asking questions about the cave's use by outlaws in the 1880s. We were in the section called the Cathedral Room, where the ceiling vaults up 40 feet and stalactites hang like frozen chandeliers, when I heard something that wasn't part of the usual acoustic environment. Cave systems have distinctive sound profiles, water dripping, air moving through passages, the occasional crack of settling rock. But this was different. A sliding, scraping noise coming from somewhere beyond the metal gate that blocks access to the unmapped eastern passages. I continued my presentation about calcium carbonate deposition rates while listening to that sound grow louder, closer, moving with purpose rather than random geological activity. The tourists noticed nothing, absorbed in photographing formations and peering into the dark spaces where our lights didn't reach. But I felt my pulse quicken, because in 8 years, I'd never heard anything like this. The tour route follows a loop that takes about 45 minutes, and I led the group through the remaining chambers, the throne room, the bridal chapel, the narrow squeeze called Fat Man's Misery, while that scraping sliding sound seemed to pace us through the walls, sometimes ahead of our position, and sometimes trailing behind, always just beyond the range of our flashlights and the installed lighting system. When we reached the section called the Crypt, where the passage narrows and the ceiling presses down to create a claustrophobic tunnel, maybe 4 feet high, I saw something that made me stop so abruptly the person behind me bumped into my back. On the far wall, just visible in the edge of my flashlight beam, were marks in the soft flowstone. Deep gouges arranged in patterns of 4, too regular to be natural erosion, too large to have been made by any animal that should exist in an Arizona cave system. I ushered the group past quickly, making jokes about the formations to keep them moving, but I couldn't stop calculating the size of whatever had left those marks. The depth of the gouges suggesting massive force applied by something with claws or talons at least 6 inches long. We emerged into the visitor center at 6:45, right on schedule, and I smiled and answered questions while helping people buy souvenirs and directing them to the parking area. After the last tourist drove away, I found Marcos, the park's maintenance supervisor, and asked him to come down into the cave with me to investigate something in the restricted section. Marcos had worked at Colossal Cave for 15 years, knew the system better than anyone, and carried keys to all the security gates, including the ones that sealed off passages deemed too dangerous or too delicate for public access. We descended through the tourist entrance with heavy-duty flashlights and a two-way radio, standard protocol for any work in the unmapped areas, and made our way to the gate nearest the cathedral room. Marcos unlocked it with a key that looked like an antique, and we stepped into passages that smelled different. Less processed air, more mineral tang, and something organic I couldn't identify. The ceiling here was lower, irregular, forcing us to move in a half-crouch while our lights swept across formations that had never been photographed for tour brochures. That's when we heard it clearly. That sliding, scraping sound, but amplified by the confined space, echoing from multiple directions simultaneously, as if whatever produced it was moving through a network of passages surrounding our position. Marcos grabbed my arm and pointed to the floor where our lights illuminated tracks in the soft cave mud. 3-toed impressions, maybe 14 inches across, pressed deep enough to suggest enormous weight, leading away into darkness that seemed to actively resist our flashlight beams. The tracks showed claws that extended beyond the toe pads, and the stride length between prints measured over 6 feet, implying something that moved with a gait no human could replicate. We followed the tracks deeper into the unmapped section, our radio crackling with static that shouldn't have been possible this far underground, where we should have lost signal entirely, and the static resolved into something that sounded like breathing, wet and rhythmic, transmitted on the emergency frequency that should have connected us to the surface station. I pressed the transmit button and called for the ranger station, but instead of Kara, the evening duty officer, I heard only that guttural breathing intensify, quicken, as if whatever produced it knew we were listening and wanted us to know it was aware. The passage opened into a chamber not shown on any map I'd ever studied. A natural room easily 100 feet across with a ceiling that disappeared beyond the range of our lights. And in that space, we saw what had been making the sounds. I can only describe it in fragments because my mind couldn't process the whole. Too large for the passages it moved through, yet somehow compressing itself to fit, proportions that shifted as it moved from one location to another. Too many joints in limbs that bent in directions biology shouldn't allow, eyes that reflected our flashlight beams from heights that suggested it could rear up 20 feet or more. It moved using a form of locomotion I'd never seen, not walking exactly but flowing across the uneven floor while its body undulated through spaces that should have been too small, its skin or hide appearing slick and pale like something that had never seen sunlight, covered in sensory organs or mouths or structures I couldn't identify. The creature turned toward us, and I heard the clicking sound then, rapid pulses that seemed to map the space around us. Echolocation, far more sophisticated than any bat species, and I understood it had been tracking us since we entered the restricted area, had probably been aware of every tour group I'd ever led through these caves, listening to our voices and our footsteps from its hidden chambers. Marcos dropped his flashlight, and the beam spun across the floor as he ran back toward the gate, and I followed without thinking, our boots slipping on wet rock as we scrambled through the low passage with that clicking intensifying behind us, echoing off walls and ceiling until it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. We cleared the security gate, and Marcos slammed it shut with hands that shook so badly he could barely fit the key into the lock. And through the bars, we could see something massive moving in the darkness beyond, too close, pressing against spaces it shouldn't be able to navigate. I radioed surface again, and this time Kara answered, her voice crackling with interference, asking why we'd been out of contact for 40 minutes when we'd only been underground for what felt like 15 at most. We reported a potential cave-in risk and recommended sealing that entire section pending geological survey, which was the only explanation Marcos and I could agree on that wouldn't sound insane. The next day, park administrators brought in a geology team from the University of Arizona who spent 3 days examining the restricted passages and returned with reports of unstable formations and increased seepage that required immediate closure of the eastern unmapped section. They found the tracks Marcos and I had followed, identified them as interesting erosion patterns possibly caused by water flow, and photographed the claw marks as examples of unusual mineral staining. The official report made no mention of anything living in those passages, concluded that the cave system was safe for continued tours in the approved sections, and recommended installation of additional security barriers between public and restricted areas. Marcos quit 2 weeks later, took a ranger position up in Flagstaff where the tours happen above ground in ponderosa forests, and we never spoke about what we saw in that unmapped chamber. I stayed on for another year, continued leading tours twice daily, kept smiling while reciting facts about limestone formation and historical outlaws, but I could never shake the awareness that something massive lived in the darkness beyond those gates, something that had been there long before humans carved out tourist pathways and installed electric lights, something patient enough to remain hidden while thousands of visitors walked through its territory, oblivious to its presence. The cave system at Colossal Cave extends for documented miles, but the unmapped sections, the passages sealed behind those gates, the chambers that appear on no survey charts, those spaces go much deeper and much farther than any official report acknowledges. I left the Park Service in 2015, moved to Tucson where I work in an office with windows and natural light and no enclosed spaces, but sometimes I dream about that clicking sound, about eyes reflecting light from impossible heights, about something flowing through stone passages with a body that defies every law of biology I was ever taught. The park still operates its tours, still brings groups into those limestone chambers twice a day year-round, and nobody mentions the sections that remain permanently closed, the gates that are never unlocked, the sounds that maintenance workers sometimes report hearing late at night when they're alone in the visitor center, and something in the depths below begins moving through its territory. I've seen the reviews online, tourists posting about strange noises during their cave tours, about feelings of being watched from dark passages beyond the lights, about shadows that seem to move independently in the deeper chambers. The responses are always the same. Staff explaining it's just acoustics playing tricks, just natural cave phenomena, just imagination amplified by the unfamiliar environment underground. But I know what lives in those unmapped sections, what moves through spaces it shouldn't be able to fit, what has been listening to human voices echo through its domain for decades while remaining hidden just beyond the reach of our lights and our understanding. Colossal Cave holds more than limestone formations and historical artifacts. It holds something ancient and patient, something perfectly adapted to darkness and stone, something that tolerates our tours and our lights and our presence because we remain confined to approved pathways, and because we always leave before we venture deep enough to find it waiting in chambers that appear on no maps. My name is Brianna, and I've been a licensed real estate appraiser in Arizona for 12 years, specializing in historic properties and estates that require specialized valuation techniques due to their age and architectural significance. Most of my work involves Victorian-era homes in the older sections of Prescott, properties built during the territorial period when this mountain town served as Arizona's capital, and wealthy merchants constructed elaborate residences designed to showcase their success. On February 9th, 2021, I received an assignment from a title company handling an estate settlement, a Victorian mansion on Mount Vernon Street that needed appraisal before probate could be finalized. The property listing described it as an 1890 Queen Anne-style home with original fixtures, maintained in pristine condition, owned by the same family since construction. I arrived at the address around 10 in the morning, parking my sedan in front of a house that looked like it had been transported directly from a 19th century photograph and placed intact on this quiet residential street. The exterior was immaculate. Gingerbread trim painted in historically accurate colors, original stained glass windows without a single crack. Even the landscaping seemed period appropriate, with roses that shouldn't have been blooming in February but were. I knocked on the ornate front door, expecting no answer since estate appraisals usually happen after the property has been vacated. But instead, the door opened immediately to reveal a woman who appeared to be in her 70s, dressed in clothing that looked expensive but outdated, the kind of formal house dress you might see in photographs from the 1950s. She introduced herself as the owner, though she never actually told me her name, and invited me inside with a gesture that felt oddly formal, almost ceremonial. The interior matched the exterior's perfection, not a single piece of furniture out of place, not a speck of dust visible on any surface. Every room appearing as if it had been staged for a museum exhibit rather than lived in as an actual residence. I began my standard process, measuring rooms and photographing architectural details while making notes on my tablet about original hardwood floors, hand-carved woodwork, and fixtures that appeared to be authentic Victorian-era installations. The owner followed me from room to room, never speaking unless I asked a direct question, her footsteps making no sound on those hardwood floors, despite the fact that old houses always creak and settle when people move through them. Each room I entered seemed frozen in a different time period, and it took me several minutes to consciously register what my subconscious had already noticed. The parlor contained furnishings and decorative items from the 1890s, but the bedroom I examined next was decorated entirely in 1920s Art Deco style, and the kitchen beyond that featured appliances and accessories from the 1950s, each space perfectly preserved, as if someone had sealed it at a specific moment and never allowed it to change. I mentioned this observation to the owner, commenting on her impressive collection of period-specific items, and she smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said something about appreciating history's layers. When I asked to see documentation for some of the more valuable antiques so I could factor their worth into the appraisal, she produced a leather portfolio containing photographs that showed the house at various stages across more than a century. The photos themselves were remarkable historical documents, daguerreotypes from the 1890s, sepia prints from the 1910s, black and white snapshots from mid-century, color Polaroids from the 1970s. But what made my hands start trembling as I flipped through them was the woman appearing in many of these photographs, standing in the same parlor or sitting on the same porch, and she looked identical across all of them. Same face, same posture, same distant expression, whether the photo was dated 1893 or 1918 or any point in between. I looked up at the owner standing beside me, watching me examine these images with an expression of patient curiosity, and I realized I was looking at the same person who appeared in photographs spanning 13 decades. My rational mind offered explanations, family resemblance across generations, women who all happened to look remarkably similar, coincidence and pareidolia making me see patterns that weren't really there. But my instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this house and this assignment. I excused myself to measure the upstairs bedrooms, needing space to think and hoping that distance would help me regain my professional composure. The second floor contained 4 bedrooms, each one decorated in its own distinct era, and in each room I found appraisal documents left on dressers or desks, official forms from previous appraisers who'd visited this property over the decades. The oldest document I found was dated 1903, written in elegant script on paper that had yellowed with age, and it described the property in terms nearly identical to what I would have written. The next was from 1919, then 1937, then 1954, then 1970, then 1987, then 2003, a pattern of appraisals occurring every 16 or 17 years, like clockwork, and every single document ended mid-sentence or mid-paragraph, as if the appraiser had simply stopped writing without completing their report. I photographed these documents with my phone, my heart hammering against my ribs, and noticed that in every appraisal, the same comment appeared somewhere in the notes. A mention of the owner's remarkable preservation of the property. A note about her dedication to maintaining historical accuracy. An observation about how she seemed to exist outside normal time. The air in the upper hallway tasted stale despite the house's apparent perfection, and I noticed the dust motes I could see floating in afternoon light coming through the window weren't actually moving, just hanging suspended like they'd been frozen in place. I descended the stairs, carefully, fighting the urge to run, maintaining my professional demeanor, even as every instinct told me to leave immediately. The owner waited in the front parlor, seated in a Victorian chair that probably cost more than my car, and she asked me a question in that same formal, outdated manner she'd used earlier. "What value do you place on eternity, Miss Brianna?" The way she said my name, which I hadn't given her, sent ice down my spine. I responded with something about historical properties, holding cultural value beyond monetary worth, keeping my voice steady while my mind raced through options for leaving this house without appearing to flee. She stood and moved to block the doorway leading to the front entrance, not threatening exactly, but positioned in a way that made escape impossible without physically pushing past her. "Every appraiser who comes here sees the same things you've seen," she continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "The rooms that don't change, the photographs that don't make sense, the documents from my previous visitors. And every appraiser makes the same choice. They can complete their report and leave with questions they'll never answer, or they can stay and become part of what makes this house eternal." I understood then that the incomplete appraisals I'd found weren't abandoned. They were interrupted, cut short because the appraisers who'd started them had chosen to stay or been unable to leave. I looked at the owner's face and saw something shift in her features, a momentary flicker where she appeared both ancient and ageless simultaneously, and I knew with absolute certainty that this woman had been standing in this house since 1890 and would continue standing here long after I was gone. My tablet felt heavy in my hands, the incomplete appraisal form displayed on its screen, showing my notes and measurements from the morning, and I made a decision that felt like betrayal of everything I'd witnessed. I told her I needed to step outside briefly to check some exterior measurements, standard procedure for complex appraisals, and she studied me with eyes that seemed to see through every lie I'd ever told. After a moment that stretched impossibly long, she stepped aside and allowed me to pass, walking with me to the front door and opening it with that same ceremonial gesture she'd used to let me in. "Complete your report accurately," she instructed, and there was weight in those words that felt like command rather than request. "Assign this property whatever value you determine appropriate, but remember that some questions are better left unasked and some observations better left unrecorded." I walked to my car with measured steps, got inside with hands that shook so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition, and drove away from Mount Vernon Street without looking in my rearview mirror because I was terrified of what I might see standing in that perfect doorway. I completed the appraisal from my office that evening, filling in the required forms with standard language about square footage and architectural features and comparable sales in the area, never mentioning the photographs or the incomplete reports or the owner who existed across 13 decades. I assigned the property a value consistent with similar Victorian estates in Prescott, submitted my report to the title company, and received my payment through normal channels. But I kept copies of the photographs I'd taken with my phone, images showing those incomplete appraisals from previous decades, and sometimes late at night I looked through them trying to find the moment when each appraiser decided to stop writing, trying to understand what choice they were offered and why some of them apparently accepted. I still work as an appraiser, still handle historic properties throughout Arizona, but I never accept assignments on Mount Vernon Street anymore. And when colleagues mention that beautiful Victorian mansion that seems to change hands every generation, I change the subject quickly before they can ask if I've ever been inside. The title company called me 6 months later, asking if I'd be willing to do a follow-up appraisal since the estate sale had fallen through and the property needed reevaluation, but I declined and recommended another appraiser from my professional network, a young woman just starting her career who probably needed the work. I never called to warn her about what she'd find there, never mentioned the photographs or the pattern of incomplete reports, because I understood that some knowledge is dangerous and some warnings only guarantee that the warned person will investigate further. The property is still there on Mount Vernon Street, still perfectly maintained, still changing owners every generation while somehow remaining exactly the same. And somewhere inside an owner who never ages continues offering the same choice to visitors who see too much and understand too little. I chose to complete my appraisal and leave with my questions unanswered, chose professional survival over truth, and I live with that choice every day, wondering if the appraisers whose incomplete reports I photographed made different decisions and what those decisions cost them in the end. Would you finish the job and leave with unanswered questions, or demand the truth knowing it might trap you forever? My name is Jocelyn, and in May 2008, I was working as a research botanist at an experimental agriculture facility just outside Yuma, Arizona, where we focused on developing drought-resistant crop varieties that could survive in extreme desert conditions with minimal water input. The facility occupied about 40 acres of former farmland, divided between conventional greenhouses, climate-controlled laboratories, and outdoor test plots where we subjected our hybrid plants to the brutal Sonoran desert environment to see which genetic modifications actually performed under real-world stress. My specialty was cellular manipulation, specifically working with plant DNA to enhance water retention and nutrient efficiency. And I'd been part of a team that had just achieved a breakthrough with a tomato variant that showed incredible promise. We'd successfully spliced genes from several native desert species, prickly pear, ocotillo, mesquite, into a common garden tomato, creating a hybrid that could theoretically produce fruit using 70% less water than conventional varieties. The project had taken 3 years of failed experiments and regulatory approvals. And when our first successful crop matured in Greenhouse 7 during the first week of May, the entire research staff celebrated what we thought would be a revolutionary advancement in agricultural science. I was responsible for monitoring the health and development of test subjects, which meant spending hours each day in the greenhouses checking leaf structure, measuring growth rates, and documenting any unusual characteristics that emerged during the plant's life cycles. On May 8th, I noticed that Denver, one of our junior researchers who'd been working closely with the new hybrids, had developed what looked like a contact rash on his forearms, raised red welts that he said had appeared overnight and didn't itch or hurt, just felt slightly warm to the touch. We had protocols for accidental exposure to experimental materials, so I sent him to the facility's medical office for examination and documentation, assuming he'd had an allergic reaction to one of the nutrient solutions we used in the hydroponic systems. He returned an hour later with antihistamine cream and clearance to continue working, and we both forgot about the incident until 3 days later when the rash had spread up his arms to his shoulders, and the texture of the affected skin had changed from inflamed to something that looked almost like bark, rough and slightly green-tinted in certain light. Denver claimed it didn't hurt, said it actually felt kind of pleasant, like being warm from the inside, and he seemed unconcerned, even as I insisted he go back to medical for more thorough evaluation. That's when things started happening fast, when the casual Monday morning shift turned into something none of us were trained to handle. The medical staff called in a dermatologist from Yuma Regional Medical Center, and while we waited for the specialist to arrive, I watched Denver's behavior change in ways that had nothing to do with skin conditions. He kept moving toward the windows, positioning himself where sunlight came through the glass most directly, and when I asked him to help me with measurements in a shaded section of the greenhouse, he became agitated and disoriented like I'd asked him to do something physically painful. His eyes had developed a strange reflective quality, the pupils appearing slightly green, and when he spoke, his words came slower, more deliberate, as if language required effort he hadn't needed to expend before. By that afternoon, 3 other staff members who'd been working in Greenhouse 7 were showing similar symptoms. The same bark-like skin texture starting at their hands and spreading upward, the same compulsive phototropism that drew them constantly toward light sources, the same gradual slowing of movement and speech. We initiated full quarantine protocols, sealed Greenhouse 7, and called in emergency response teams from the State Agriculture Department and the CDC. But the progression of whatever was happening moved faster than our bureaucratic response systems could match. I watched through observation windows as Denver's transformation accelerated, his skin splitting along the forearms, not with blood, but with green shoots that emerged from the fissures, like the plant matter had been growing beneath his flesh, waiting for room to expand. He didn't scream or show signs of pain, just stood in the brightest spot of sunlight he could find and let it happen, stems pushing through his pores and unfurling leaves that looked like they belonged to our hybrid tomato plants, but were growing from human tissue in violation of every biological law I'd ever studied. The other infected researchers were following the same pattern, their bodies becoming host environments for plant growth that seemed to use their circulatory systems as root networks and their skin as soil, and the worst part was that they remained conscious and aware during the entire process, their eyes tracking movement, and their mouths forming words even as their vocal cords became choked with vegetation. I was suited up in full hazmat gear by then, part of the containment team trying to understand what we were dealing with and how to stop it. And I'll never forget the moment when Denver looked directly at me through the observation window and mouthed words I could read on his lips, even though no sound emerged. "It's beautiful in here." The transformation took about 6 hours from skin rash to complete integration of plant and human tissue. 6 hours during which we documented everything, while simultaneously failing to find any medical intervention that slowed or reversed the process. Antifungals did nothing, antibiotics did nothing, even aggressive treatments that should have killed plant cells had no effect on whatever was happening to our colleagues. By evening, Denver was more plant than human, his body completely covered in stems and leaves and buds that were beginning to flower, actual tomato plant flowers blooming from what had been his shoulders and chest, and roots had begun pushing through the soles of his feet to anchor him to the greenhouse floor. He was still conscious, still aware, and that awareness was the most horrifying part because we could see the humanity in his eyes, even as his body ceased to function in any human way. The other 3 infected researchers had reached similar stages, transformed into hybrid organisms that defied classification, and we were forced to make decisions that still haunt me a decade later. The facility director ordered immediate termination of the infected subjects before the condition could spread beyond containment, before whatever our hybrid plants had become could find a way to reproduce or propagate using human hosts as vectors. I wasn't part of the team that carried out that order, but I was there when Greenhouse 7 was filled with a chemical compound designed to kill all biological material, regardless of classification, and I watched through thick glass as the plants that had been my colleagues burned and withered and finally stopped moving. The official report blamed a contamination event, chemical exposure from a storage tank failure that caused severe allergic reactions and respiratory failure, and the families of the 4 researchers who died were compensated through facility insurance without ever learning what actually happened to their loved ones. We destroyed all the hybrid plants, burned the entire crop, and sterilized the growing medium and decontaminated every surface in Greenhouse 7 before sealing it permanently. The project was classified as failed. The research data was locked in secure archives that required federal clearance to access, and every staff member who witnessed the event signed non-disclosure agreements backed by legal consequences we were told would include criminal charges if we ever spoke publicly about what we'd seen. I transferred to a different research facility 6 months later, left agriculture entirely, and moved into theoretical botany, where I work with computer models instead of living specimens. But the dreams never stopped. I dream in chlorophyll green, see photosynthesis when I close my eyes, and I've developed an irrational fear of sunlight that makes me keep my apartment blinds closed, even on beautiful Arizona days. I wear long sleeves year-round despite the heat, checking my skin obsessively for any sign of discoloration or texture change. And I avoid gardens and parks because being near growing things triggers panic attacks I've learned to manage but never fully control. The facility still operates, still conducts agricultural research under the same mission to develop drought-resistant crops. And Greenhouse 7 sits empty with warning signs about structural instability keeping everyone away from the space, where we turned 4 people into experiments that failed in the most catastrophic way possible. Sometimes I wonder if we really killed all the hybrid plants, if any seeds might have survived in the soil or been carried away on someone's shoes. And I monitor the news obsessively for reports of unusual plant growth or unexplained illnesses that might indicate our creation found a way to persist beyond our attempts at eradication. The worst part isn't what happened to Denver and the others, though that's terrible enough. The worst part is remembering his face when he said it was beautiful, when he was halfway between human and plant and experiencing something we could never understand, and wondering if maybe the transformation wasn't the violation we thought it was, but instead some kind of transcendence that looked like horror from the outside but felt like evolution from within. I still have samples, tissue collected during the early stages before everything went catastrophic, preserved in cryogenic storage in a personal freezer I keep in my garage. I tell myself I'm holding on to evidence in case the official story ever changes, in case someone decides the truth needs to be told. But I know the real reason. Some part of me is fascinated by what we created, by the possibility that we accidentally discovered a form of existence beyond the boundaries that separate plant from animal. And I keep those samples because destroying them would mean admitting that the fear is stronger than the curiosity, that the horror outweighs the wonder. I'm still a scientist, still driven by questions even when the answers terrify me. And every time I open that freezer and look at those vials, I think about Denver standing in sunlight with flowers blooming from his shoulders, conscious and aware, and telling me it was beautiful. And I wonder what he saw in those final hours that made him smile even as he stopped being human. If you could experience something beyond human consciousness, but knew you'd never return to your old self, would you take that chance? My name is Gianni, and I've driven 18-wheelers across the Southwest for 14 years, hauling everything from produce out of Yuma to construction materials bound for Vegas, always preferring the night runs when traffic thins out and the highways belong to just me and the hum of diesel engines. Interstate 17 between Camp Verde and Flagstaff cuts straight through some of the most remote high desert you'll find anywhere. Pine forests giving way to open scrubland where cell service drops, and the only lights come from your headlights and the occasional mile marker flashing by. On November 12th, 2002, I was northbound with a load of lumber, making good time after picking up in Phoenix when I passed mile marker 239 for what should have been the one and only time on that stretch. The marker stood on the right shoulder, illuminated by my high beams, standard green sign with white numbers reflecting back at me, just like every other one I'd passed that night. But something about it stuck in my mind. The way the numbers seemed to glow a little too bright. The way my CB radio crackled with static right as I went by. I shook it off as fatigue, checked my gauges, and adjusted the air ride suspension for the upcoming grade. But about 12 miles later, there it was again. Mile marker 239, same position on the right shoulder, same oversized boulders lining the roadside that I'd noticed the first time. My foot came off the accelerator instinctively, the big rig slowing as my brain tried to process the impossibility. And that's when the radio started cycling through broadcasts that made no sense in chronological order. 1950s country music giving way to 1970s talk radio, then 1980s pop, all playing backward through the speakers like someone had rewound time itself. I grabbed the mic to call dispatch, but got nothing but more static layered with those reversed voices. And when I glanced at the dash, the odometer had frozen at 239.0 miles, refusing to increment no matter how fast the truck rolled. Fuel gauge was climbing instead of dropping, temperature needle twitching erratically, and the clock on the dash showed 2:39 regardless of how many minutes passed. I pulled onto the shoulder at what my GPS insisted was mile marker 240, engine idling rough as if fighting itself, and stepped out into freezing November air that smelled wrong, like old magnetic tape mixed with pine sap and diesel fumes that hadn't burned clean. Headlights swept the area, revealing that same boulder formation, same mile marker, now reading 239 again when I walked back to check. And in the distance, I saw headlights approaching southbound. My own truck, identical down to the company logo on the door, driven by a version of myself, who looked 10 years older with gray at the temples and deeper lines around the eyes. He passed without slowing, our eyes meeting through windshields for the split second it took to cross paths, and I swear he nodded, like he recognized me from some future he already lived. Back in the cab, I slammed the door and accelerated hard, 18 gears grinding as I pushed north again, but the pattern repeated. 12 miles later, mile marker 239 appeared for the third time, radio now broadcasting pre-television aerotones and Morse code patterns that my brain tried and failed to decode. Odometer still locked at 239.0. Fuel gauge reading full. Clock eternally 239. And this time when the southbound truck appeared, it was me from even further in the future, hair completely white, face gaunt like a man who'd aged decades and months. The CB came alive with my own voice broadcasting in reverse. Words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my gut as warnings I should have heeded. By the fourth pass of mile marker 239, I was sweating through my flannel shirt, despite the 40-degree chill, hands locked white-knuckled on the wheel, as the dashboard instruments all synced to that impossible timestamp. 239 on every gauge, every light pulsing in unison like the truck itself, had become part of whatever temporal distortion gripped that stretch of highway. Southbound headlights appeared again, but this time the truck slowed as it approached, matching my speed until we rolled parallel, window to window, and the older me stared across the median with eyes that held decades of trapped time. His mouth moved, but no sound came through, just that reversed CB chatter layering over engine noise and wind roar, and in that moment I understood the loop. Every 16 minutes, I returned to mile marker 239, aging forward while simultaneously witnessing my future selves trapped in reverse progression. I pulled over at dawn, or what felt like dawn, engine finally quitting as sunlight crested the mountains, and the mile marker ahead read 240 for the first time. Date on the dash showing Tuesday instead of the Thursday it should have been. 3 days lost, fuel tank inexplicably full, odometer showing I'd traveled exactly 0 net miles, despite hundreds circled in that temporal trap. I called dispatch from a truck stop in Flagstaff, claimed mechanical issues, and road closure forced the delay, and they bought it without question, because my logbook matched their records perfectly. Kept a written journal from that night forward, documenting every anomaly on every run. Odometer glitches, time slips, mile markers that repeated or skipped numbers. but nothing ever matched the severity of November 12th. Interstate 17 still carries truckers north from Camp Verde to Flagstaff every night. Mile marker 239 passes unremarked by most drivers who never notice the boulder formation or the way certain stretches seem to stretch longer than their mileage suggests. CB chatter occasionally mentions ghost riders or time slips, but gets laughed off as road hypnosis or too much coffee. My log from that night shows clean entries in handwriting that changes progressively across pages. From my normal tight script to looser scrawl to near illegible chicken scratch, as if my future selves contributed from within the loop. Now I avoid I-17 after dark when possible, take longer routes through Payson or along Route 66. But sometimes dreams pull me back to that shoulder, where headlights approach from the south carrying versions of myself I hope never to become. Mile marker 239 waits patient as highway concrete for the next long-haul driver, who passes at 2:39 a.m., ready to begin the cycle anew. What would you do if you saw your future self driving toward you on a dark highway? My name is Alexis, and in August 2016, I started my clinical psychology internship at University Medical Center's psychiatric wing in Tucson, Arizona, a 12-week rotation that promised hands-on experience with acute mental health cases under the supervision of licensed professionals. The psych ward occupied the 4th floor of the main hospital building, a secure unit with keycard access, reinforced glass windows, and 24-hour surveillance designed to protect both patients and staff from the unpredictable behaviors that sometimes emerged in acute psychosis. My first week focused on observation and documentation, shadowing senior psychologists during rounds and group therapy sessions, learning the protocols for patient interaction and crisis de-escalation. On my 4th day, I was assigned to a specific patient in room 412, a woman in her late 40s who'd been admitted 3 weeks earlier after a voluntary commitment, presenting with what the chart described as elaborate delusional system involving identity substitution. She sat calmly on her bed when I entered for morning check-in, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp and assessing as she watched me review her medication log. "You're new," she said without preamble, her voice clear and measured despite the diagnosis. "They rotate the interns because the real ones notice too much. I'm Leah. You're safe for now. You're still original." I noted the paranoia in her speech patterns as per protocol, asked standard questions about sleep and appetite, and scheduled her for afternoon therapy with the attending psychiatrist. But Leah's delusion was unusually specific. She claimed that everyone around her had been replaced by imperfect copies, entities that mimicked human behavior, but betrayed themselves through subtle tells like microsecond delays in conversation, unnatural symmetry in facial movements, and repetitive gestures that genuine humans wouldn't repeat unconsciously. She described how the copies maintained the illusion by isolating originals, processing them through unknown methods, and assuming their identities seamlessly. I documented everything in her chart, flagged it for supervisory review, and moved on to my other assignments, dismissing the claims as classic Capgras syndrome, where familiar faces appear as imposters. By the end of the first week, though, I'd started noticing patterns in staff behavior that Leah had described. Dr. Lucian, my supervising psychiatrist, paused half a second too long before responding to direct questions, his blinks perfectly synchronized like a machine calibrating, and during rounds, he'd repeat the exact same hand gesture, adjusting his glasses in precisely the same arc, 3 times in one conversation. I told myself it was confirmation bias, my brain pattern matching to fit the patient's narrative, but I began timing his responses with my phone's stopwatch hidden in my pocket, confirming the consistent 0.3-second delay every time. During lunch in the staff break room, I watched nurses exchanging glances that felt coordinated rather than spontaneous, their laughter occurring in perfect unison without the natural overlaps of genuine group conversation. The food tasted identical, no matter what was labeled on the menu. Mashed potatoes indistinguishable from chicken salad, every bite delivering the same bland uniformity that coated my tongue like processed paste. I reviewed security footage from the hallway cameras after my shift, accessed through the intern training portal, and saw staff members standing motionless in corners when no patients or visitors were present. Positions they'd hold for minutes at a time before resuming movement with mechanical precision. Leah noticed my growing unease during our next session, leaning forward with an intensity that felt like recognition rather than delusion. "You're seeing it now," she whispered, glancing at the observation window where Dr. Lucian stood watching us. The delay in his responses, the way his pupils don't react to light changes. "You're still real, Alexis. They haven't processed you yet. But your predecessor, she resigned last month. Check her signature." I pulled her chart and found the previous intern's termination paperwork, a standard form with neat handwriting that matched the body of the document, but clashed completely with the wild scrawl on the signature line, as if two different people had filled it out. That night, I couldn't sleep, replaying hallway footage in my apartment, pausing frames where orderlies moved in synchronized patterns through empty corridors, their footsteps echoing with identical rhythm that no human gait naturally produces. The antiseptic smell permeating the ward masked something organic underneath, like damp concrete mixed with copper pennies, and handshakes with colleagues transferred no body heat, their palms cool and unyielding like latex over metal. By week 6, my notes had shifted from clinical observation to personal documentation, written in a coded journal using medical abbreviations and reversed chronology to hide my growing certainty that Leah wasn't delusional. She was the last original in a ward where staff had been systematically replaced. I confronted Dr. Lucian during a private supervision session, asking directly about the previous intern's sudden resignation, and watched his pupils fail to contract when I shone my penlight in his eyes. "Routine administrative change," he said with that telltale pause, his glasses adjustment executing flawlessly. "Focus on your rotation completion, Alexis." I transferred to a different unit the next day, citing scheduling conflicts, but not before copying security footage to a personal drive and interviewing Leah one final time. "They'll come for you too," she said, her voice steady as I packed my notes. "Ones who see don't get to leave quietly. Document everything. Stay original." I graduated with honors, secured a position at a different hospital across town, but the patterns followed. Colleagues with synchronized blinks, food that tasted like uniform paste, handshakes without warmth. My journal grew into volumes, coded entries tracking replacements across Tucson medical facilities, cross-referenced with resignation patterns and patient complaints dismissed as paranoia. Leah was discharged a month after I left, listed as stabilized, but her final chart note read, "Patient insists on reality verification protocols," signed in handwriting that matched neither Dr. Lucian's nor any previous physician's on record. I avoid hospitals now when possible, stick to telehealth consultations in private practice. But late at night, I review footage from that summer, frame by frame, searching for the moment when staff became copies and wondering if Leah was original or just better at the mimicry. The psych ward continues operations. Interns rotate through every 12 weeks. Patients come and go with diagnoses that increasingly reference imposter phenomena. Security footage from 2016 remains archived, accessible only to cleared personnel, but I've preserved my copies, time-stamped evidence of motionless figures in empty hallways, synchronized movements, unresponsive pupils. Was Leah warning me or preparing me? Am I still original, documenting from the outside, or did the processing happen silently during one of those delayed handshakes? The question haunts every interaction, every bland meal, every perfectly timed blink from colleagues who seem too coordinated to be real. when everyone around you starts acting unnaturally perfect? Do you trust your eyes or convince yourself it's just paranoia? My name is Silas, and for 29 years I've patrolled the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument as a U.S. Border Patrol agent, covering the 330,000 acres of pristine Sonoran desert that straddle Arizona's international boundary with Mexico. The monument's terrain is brutally unforgiving. Towering saguaros rise like ancient monoliths from valleys of organ pipe cactus and creosote bush, where daytime temperatures soar past 115 degrees and nights plunge to freezing under star-packed skies that feel close enough to touch. In April 1994, during one of my standard midnight-to-dawn shifts, I was stationed at Observation Post Echo 7 overlooking Alamo Canyon, a rugged wash system where smugglers often attempted crossings under darkness. The air hung heavy with creosote scent, sharp and medicinal, when around 2:17 a.m. my binoculars caught movement 800 yards south. Elongated figures gliding between saguaros, humanoid but stretched impossibly tall, limbs bending at midpoints no human skeleton could accommodate. They moved without disturbing the talus slopes or scattering the pea gravel that crunched under my boots during foot patrols, flowing from cactus to cactus, like liquid shadows cast by a moon that wasn't full. I swept the area with my night vision monocular and saw them clearly. 7 feet tall minimum, narrow torsos tapering to heads without discernible facial features, skin mottled in desert camouflage patterns that shifted with the terrain. No footprints marked the fine silty soil where javelina tracks crisscrossed abundantly. Only a fresh arrangement of rocks forming interlocking spirals and crosses unlike any Tohono O'odham petroglyphs from my cultural training manuals. My handheld radio crackled with interference, not the usual border frequency chatter, but harmonic tones resonating like struck tuning forks, vibrating through the truck's chassis until my teeth buzzed. I transmitted position and description to base, but response dissolved into garbled whispers later identified by linguists as archaic O'odham dialect, predating Spanish contact by centuries. The figures paused collectively, saguaro arms within 50 yards, rotating their needles northward in unison, moonlight bending around the entities like refraction through warped glass. Temperature plummeted 30 degrees instantly, sand pulsing with subsonic vibrations that climbed my spine, air thinning to hypoxic levels, tasting of alkaline minerals and rusted iron on my tongue. The lead figure approached the largest saguaro, a 30-foot specimen estimated at 200 years old, placed elongated palms against green flesh, and the cactus rippled like pond surface disturbed by falling rock. Needles retracted as bark flowed liquidly over the silhouette, merging entity and plant until only a single form remained, arms now bearing human-like joints that flexed experimentally. I retreated to my Ford Explorer, engine turning over rough as the figures multiplied, now a dozen strong, arranging stones into kilometer-scale patterns visible only from elevation denied to ground patrols. Over the next 6 nights, they shadowed every patrol route precisely, maintaining 400-yard buffer zones where creosote bushes leaned toward them, and barrel cacti spines aligned in arrow formations pointing south. My thermal imager registered them as ambient temperature, indistinguishable from surrounding geology. Yet audio sensors captured clicking harmonies that analyzed as non-random mathematical progressions. On night 4, stationed at Growler Pass Overlook, I witnessed 3 figures simultaneously merge with organ pipes, cactus pleats undulating as if breathing, emitting pollen clouds that drifted northward, carrying mineral scent mixed with human sweat. Radio traffic captured full sentences in extinct dialect. Guardians reclaim passage, witness becomes flock. Broadcast on all emergency channels simultaneously. Station logs show my reports filed but reclassified faunal mice identification by 0600 each morning. Night Supervisor Bailey summoning me to briefings where veteran agents exchanged knowing glances. Silas, you've pulled Echo 7 12 straight nights, Bailey said during morning debrief, her voice low over coffee that tasted of scorched plastic despite fresh brew. Dessert does things to solo patrols. Heat mirages persist after dark. Play with peripheral vision. She slid me fresh NVG batteries and a Psych eval referral form. But her eyes betrayed shared knowledge. Her own transfer request from Quito Baquito sector denied 3 years prior, after environmental anomaly reports. By week 2, 5 agents admitted identical encounters spanning decades. Figures merging with cacti, stone glyphs multiplying overnight, harmonic resonances triggering migraines. Incident logs from 1978 referenced saguaro pilgrims, 1982 cactus sentinels, all downgraded to equipment malfunction. Bailey confessed during midnight shift change that her first sighting occurred 1989 at Sanita Basin, figures emerging from cholla thickets, arranging quartz into non-Euclidean lattices that disappeared by dawn. They choose who sees, she whispered, scanning empty dispatch office. Target loners, night shifters. Transfers get denied because they follow you regardless. Official policy required documentation, but chain of command funneled reports to unidentified aerial phenomena files archived in Washington. My final documented encounter occurred April 27th, a zone 200 hours, at Dripping Springs, figures 20 yards distant, moonlight refracting into prismatic halos around elongated forms, saguaro arms pointing directly at my position, while thousands of needles rotated tracking my heartbeat. Primary entity extended cluster of tendrils where hands should terminate, waving in creosote-scented breeze, originating from stone circle behind it. Ground resonance formed words. Shepherd claimed territory. Blood renews soil. As entity's cactus host extruded flowering arm toward border. Fence, half-mile north. Bailey's truck crested ridge simultaneously. High beams sweeping entities into vapor. She claimed mechanical assist call, but thermal footage showed 12 heat signatures dispersing into parent saguaros. Post-incident Psych eval cleared me for duty, but transfer requests vanished from personnel systems. Monument Rangers report identical phenomena independently, cacti migrating inches nightly, stone spirals expanding 3% annually, pollen clouds carrying human DNA markers. Bailey rotated to headquarters after 6th sighting, her replacement sighting entities week 2 before, requesting psychiatric leave. I patrol alone now, headlights sweeping valleys, where elongated shadows flow between 200-year-old saguaros, bearing bark patterns resembling screaming faces under infrared. Stone glyphs cover 40 square miles now, forming glyphs discernible only via satellite imagery classified by DHS. Figures appear weekly, closer each time, merging rituals, evolving, entire groves animating as single organisms during equinoxes. Radio captures progress from whispers to commands. Flock returns to fold, border dissolves in green. Transfers denied indefinitely. New agents cycle through unaware until first merge, witnessing breaks them or binds them eternally. Organ Pipe's true border patrol comprises entities predating Hohokam petroglyphs by millennia, guarding passages no treaty defines against incursions from either side. Some nights I feel tendrils brushing consciousness, ancient voices offering shepherd's mantle, merge with territory, become eternal guardian, or face dissolution as intruder. Bailey vanished during 1999 inventory, truck found at Sanita Basin with keys in ignition, seat warm as if she'd stepped out moments prior. Her personnel file lists voluntary retirement, forwarding address blank. Monument continues operations, visitors warned of extreme heat dangers, while rangers exchange glyphs sightings during lunch breaks. Figures wait patiently beyond flashlight range. Cactus hosts breathing in harmonic cycles. Stone spirals converging on border markers. They'll dissolve come solstice. I patrol because relief agents last 14 days, maximum before entities claim them as flock. Monument requiring shepherds who comprehend the true boundary. Living membrane between worlds, patrolled by saguaro flesh guardians, older than human migration itself. What secrets does your desert hide that only reveals itself after midnight? My name is Andy, and in September 2023, I served as lead foreman for Pinnacle Homes' luxury subdivision project carved into Scottsdale's McDowell Sonoran Preserve, where heavy equipment chewed through ironwood groves to expose house foundations for million-dollar spec homes targeting snowbirds from Chicago and tech execs from Silicon Valley. The site occupied 120 acres of rugged foothill terrain, pinon pines, and Palo Verde shading boulder fields we dynamited flat for building pads numbered HS1 through HS42. On September 12th, during foundation excavation for HS27, my D9 dozer operator radioed frantic from the pit. "Andy, get down here. The bucket hit something solid, not rock, and it's ringing like a tuning fork." I descended the cut with Bailey, our geotech consultant, expecting buried utility lines or prehistoric midden, but found the dozer blade wedged against black stone unlike any native geology, matte obsidian streaked with iridescent veins that shifted colors under our LED lamps, surface etched with interlocking geometries defying Euclidean measurement, angles folded inward on themselves, edges appearing blunt from one direction but razor-sharp from another, triggering vertigo when stared at too long. Bailey's rock hammer glanced off without marking the surface. Her Brunton compass spun wildly 30 feet distant, and her densitometer registered impossible specific gravity, fluctuating between lead and hydrogen. Carbon dating samples returned pre-Clovis results, 17,000 BC minimum, but stratigraphic context placed the formation at 2.3 million years old, predating Homo erectus migration. We halted excavation pending engineering review, but corporate timelines demanded progress. By week's end, track hose stripped topsoil across 3 acres, revealing the structure extended laterally, forming perfect spiral descending at 23.7-degree pitch, matching no known architecture. Crews developed identical nightmares, vast geometries observing Earth from subsurface voids, pressure behind eyeballs like staring into solar prominences. Safety meetings documented mass hallucinations, but porta-potty graffiti depicted the same impossible angles scrawled by different hands. On day 9, HS32 foundation crew uncovered vertical shaft 6 feet diameter, descending beyond probe depth. Dropped laser rangefinder returned 4.7-mile depth before signal failed. Concrete test cylinder placed inside shaft, floated upward, defying 3,000 psi slump weight. Night shift foreman reported synchronized chanting from workers during sleep breaks. Identical phrases in glossolalia, later transcribed as non-Indo-European root structure, predating Sumerian cuneiform by millennia. By excavation week 3, shaft diameter expanded to cathedral scale, walls bearing bas relief depicting non-Euclidean polyhedra, orbiting Earth under skies containing 5 luminaries. Shadows cast by work lights fell perpendicular to light source. Gravel vibrated in subsonic resonance, causing nausea and nosebleeds. Bailey resigned September 28th, citing pregnancy, but ultrasound later revealed her fetus positioned wrong, limbs arranged in geometric ratios matching shaft spiral. 6 crew members hospitalized exhibiting shared phrase compulsion during REM sleep, EEG synchronized across isolation rooms. Corporate ordered concrete pour October 2nd. 4,000 cubic yards, high-strength mix dumped continuously 72 hours to seal anomaly pending federal review. Surveyors documented poor surface perfectly level despite uneven subgrade. Seismic sensors registered no thermal bloom from exothermic hydration. Development proceeded atop sealed void. Model homes HS-27 through HS-32 marketed as McDowell Panorama Estates, with infinity pools overlooking Bahada, where cosmic geometry slumbered. First closings occurred December 2023. HS-29 buyers complained of synchronized dreams, interior shadows migrating clockwise against sun angles. HOA covenants prohibited excavation deeper than 5 feet, citing geotechnical stability. Andy accepted buyout package January 2024, relocated to Sedona, running skid steers for vineyard terracing. But dreams persist. Geometries teaching forbidden mathematics during hypnagogic states. Compulsion to return intensifying monthly. Bailey vanished March 2024 during routine OB appointment. Vehicle found at HS-27 driveway with keys inside. Sonogram showing perfect spiral coiling within womb. Pinnacle Homes lists all McDowell properties sold. Development expanding phase through Sudu atop original shaft coordinates. Drone footage captures model home foundations glowing faintly under infrared, shadows converging nightly towards sealed epicenter. Andy monitors satellite imagery, showing subdivision spirals expanding 1.2% monthly, matching shaft pitch. Glossolalia phrases return during full moons. Earth observer returns, vessel prepared. Spoken identically across former crew now scattered statewide. Federal agencies classified site cultural preservation easement, prohibiting geophysical surveys. Scottsdale zoning approved 200 additional luxury pads. Marketing brochure claims ancient energy vortex enhances wellness. Andy purchased HS-31 off-market June 2025. Moved family into model home where walls hum subsonically and infant daughter babbles geometric progressions. Dreams resolved into instruction. Spiral extends 47 miles downward, terminating in chamber containing pre-human intelligence observing surface evolution. Concrete seal thinning, 3% monthly. Foundation cracks emit ozone and phosphor scent. Andy teaches daughter spiral mathematics nightly. Her tiny fingers tracing bas relief patterns emerging in nursery drywall. Corporate merger documents list Pinnacle Homes acquired for asset preservation. HS-27 model home designated corporate retreat hosting off-book summits. Bailey cited September 2025 wandering Salt River bed, reciting chants. 7 months pregnant with symmetrical fetus visible through translucent abdomen. Andy declined. Law enforcement report citing family matter. Subdivision now covers 480 acres. Street layout forming primary glyphs visible from McDowell Peak trailhead. Neighbors synchronize sleep cycles nightly. Neighborhood Watch reporting improved community cohesion. Andy accepted position as Phase 3 Superintendent, relocation package including HS-12 corner lot, where original dozer strike originated. Daughter's first word formed perfect nonagon. Playroom floor tiles rearranged themselves into shaft cross-section overnight. Concrete pour records show 4,700 cubic yards delivered, not 4,000 as ordered. Federal oversight team rotated out after 6 weeks, citing inconclusive findings. Andy's final log entry, October 31, 2025. Vessel complete. Observers ascend. Shepherds welcome return. McDowell Panorama Estates HOA newsletter announces groundbreaking Unity Festival, November 15th, atop HS-27 coordinates. Andy's family attends wearing ceremonial clothing woven from iridescent stone fibers, extruded through foundation cracks. Spiral mathematics now taught in district curriculum. Scottsdale schools report enhanced spatial reasoning district-wide. Andy surrendered original survey logs to corporate archives marked proprietary geomantic data. Dreams ended November 1st. Waking reality now matches former hypnagogia perfectly. Bailey delivered November 14th at HS-27 Infinity Pool, newborn exhibiting 5-lobed symmetry and bioluminescent subdermal veins. Festival commences 300 hours, November 15th. Seismic stations register 4.7-mile cavern collapse beneath subdivision. Andy addresses attendees from sealed foundation center. Earth's observers return through prepared vessels. Shepherds complete the welcome. Spiral geometry is now visible county-wide via LIDAR surveys. Federal airspace restrictions prohibit aerial photography. Pinnacle Homes rebranded Vortex Realty Partners. Portfolio expanded to Sedona, Joshua Tree, Skinwalker Ranch. Andy promoted Executive Geomancer. Relocation to corporate headquarters carved into McDowell monolith HS00. Daughter enrolls pre-K program teaching primary glyphs. Classmates exhibit synchronized dreaming patterns. Bailey serves HOA president, abdomen displaying permanent bas relief map of 47-mile shaft network. Subdivision population triples overnight. Neighbors report improved existential alignment. Andy's wife delivers twins November 16th, exhibiting perfect polyhedral skeletal structure, visible through translucent dermal layers. Corporate merger completes November 17th, forming Terran Observation Collective. Stock ticker TOC spirals upward 237% first trading day. Federal declaration designates McDowell Panorama Estates National Geometry Preserve. Andy's final personal log, November 18th. Vessel array operational. Observers confirmed surface contact. Shepherd protocol complete. Would you build your dream home knowing ancient watchers slumbered beneath your foundation? 9 Arizona nightmares revealed, each true, each terrifying, each waiting beneath everyday landscapes. Unheard. Fears brought you stories the desert doesn't want told. If you felt the watchers stir tonight, smash like, subscribe for weekly true horror, and comment your location. Something ancient might already know where you sleep. Welcome to the fears that whisper from below.